why China will never stop until it replaces the United States. Hello, welcome to Dangerous Policy, a channel aimed at intelligent people wanting to discuss important issues facing life and society. My name is Crispin, and today I want to explain why Robert Zoellick's comment many years ago that one day China will emerge as a so-called responsible stakeholder in the US-led international order was always a fantasy, and why China will stop at nothing until it is easily the most preeminent power in the international system. First of all is China's conception of itself. China sees itself as the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom not in some geographic Middle Earth kind of way. The Middle Kingdom as the hierarchy between the Jade Emperor in heaven and earth. The leadership of the Chinese government being the paragon of human cultural attainment. And this is a belief that China managed to sustain for some 1,500 years until in the 19th century, there was a dispute between the British government and the Chinese government over the sale of opium. The Chinese thought that opium was highly addictive, destructive for the population, and they didn't want to buy it. Whereas Britain had its own addiction, which was Chinese tea, and there was a huge, massive trade imbalance between those two countries. So Britain was embarrassed by this and wanted a product that the Chinese would be interested in buying, and they thought that product was opium. They were extremely annoyed that China had closed its ports to this product and wanted to force this on the Chinese by force. Now, until this point, China treated the European powers as distant barbarians. The Chinese had a hierarchy of societies based on their geographic and cultural proximity to China. So, of course, you had the Chinese Han people, you had the Chinese emperor, Confucian society on top of all of that. But then you also had other kind of satellite Confucian societies. The topmost rung was the Chosun dynasty of the Koreans, who adopted all these Chinese cultural practices. And then further afield, more barbarian, kind of less trustworthy groups like Japan. And then, concentrically out towards Thailand and so forth. And what would happen is that they were the center of a tributary system of diplomacy. People would come to China and give gifts. The Indians would give elephants. The Japanese might give some weapons. And the Chinese would sit there and be like, yes, this is all tribute, and they're paying homage to the great civilization that is China. It was extremely China-centric, extremely, pejoratively you'd say, it was extremely culturally arrogant, and it just believed themselves superior in every possible way. And then when the foreign powers of Western Europe came, the Chinese couldn't perceive what was happening as anything other than another form of tribute. They go, yes, the Indians give us elephants. You seem to give us these clock devices that measure time and have these strange mechanics. Yeah, that's kind of neat, but we're not interested in them. We're not going to adopt them or import them. We just take those gifts as you venerating us. And they would say, oh, these strange contraptions of guns and whatnot. Oh, well, they're obviously primitive toys for people that aren't militarily sophisticated like our soldiers, that sort of thing. So when the Britain decided to open up China by force, 11 steamships rode up the Yangtze River, destroyed China, and brought the entire country to its knees. It was, psychologically for China, for the Chinese leadership, this was beyond something that was possible to imagine. It was like aliens coming from out of space. The idea that China, the greatest civilization in the world, could be brought so low by this tiny little island in the North Atlantic was preposterous. And yet there they were. They were forced to sign a series of unequal treaties. It opened up the country to a whole lot of trading spheres. The other Western powers went in and got their share. And the Qing dynasty ultimately collapsed in 1912 after a Boxer Rebellion because the country was so weak they could no longer sustain the distance between their self-perception and the reality. China was absolutely dominated by foreign powers. Now, how was this possible? Well, first of all, China's sense of itself prevented it from understanding that they should learn from the innovations of other societies. This was something that the Japanese understood perfectly well. The Japanese went through their Meiji Restoration. They had the samurai feudal warring period, so much of their cultural Shinto tradition tied up in that, and yet they realized immediately how much more advantageous these American weapons and these Western systems of governance and industrial forms of production were. So they jettisoned all of the samurai crap straight away and focused on modernizing and industrializing their economy and creating their own colonial power, which became extremely expansionist and rapidly powerful. So that's why Japan managed to subjugate China so easily. Well, not easily, but so completely in the 1930s. But why Britain itself managed to just take over the world and create an empire on which the sun never set? Well, that's because until the 1800s, each individual worker produced roughly the same amount wherever they were in the world, right? So to be the most powerful, wealthy, strongest nation was to have the most people and the best land. And thus, in order to expand your power, you expanded to new territories, you captured new settlements and organizations, incorporate them into your dominant power, spread your arable land, and that would increase your national power. Whereas what happened with the Industrial Revolution is that they would harness energy from coal, energy from electricity, and that broke the nexus between how much an individual could produce and the total amount that the national economy could create. And that's why this tiny little Great Britain just took over the world, because that's where the Industrial Revolution first took off. Now, China went through an enormous century of humiliation, as they call it. You had the communists rise to power after the Second World War, after a bloody civil war with the nationalists in 1945 to 49. Mao becomes the leader of China, and he kicks off the Cultural Revolution, which just puts China back into the dark ages. Huge amounts of privation, starvation, trauma, as he kind of creates this communist society with so-called Chinese characteristics. Well, in the late 1970s, Deng Xiaoping takes over and he realizes that the West has massive advantages. One of those advantages is the benefits of a market economy, opening up your economy, learning from other countries, adopting their innovations, allowing the free market to produce goods and services, and unleashing the true potential of China's vast population. And as a consequence of that, with some fairly clever stewardship from a technocratic government, we saw, the rise of the Chinese economy from literally nothing to becoming, as we speak, the world's largest economy in the world in the next few years. Why then will China stop at nothing, even though it benefited from the terms of trade with the United States, even though it's benefited from the peace and stability of the Western Pacific? Why will China stop at nothing to be the most powerful country in the world and replace the United States, kick the United States completely out of Asia and send them scurrying back to their corner of the earth or on the ostracized part of the Northern Atlantic? Well, China still sees itself as the Middle Kingdom. They see the century of humiliation as a blip where foreign powers carve them up. They see it very much like the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, and see this as just a temporary setback in the long story of the thousands of years old civilization that is China and its manifest destiny to be the most powerful country of the world and the sun around which the rest of the international system then orbits. That's why you have the One Belt, One Road initiative, why they're building railways from Beijing to London, is because they want to tie everything to China, and thus essentially going back to the tributary system that existed before the 19th century, but instead of just incorporating those satellite countries in Asia, having the tendrils right out across the rest of the world. China as well, its self-conception is they're not seeing themselves as emerging. They're not a newly emerging country. They see themselves as re-emerging. The way to think about it is an individual is much more likely to forego an unrealized gain than to accept a current loss, right? So for example, if you ask an individual, would you forego being 2% richer in the future if all climate change could be combated? Well, most people say, yes, of course. But if you go, okay, would you be happy to be 2% poorer than you are now to combat climate change? Far fewer people accept that. People are much less likely to accept a loss than to forego an unrealized gain. China is not emerging on the world stage for the first time. China is seeing itself as a country simply reclaiming its past glory, going back to the natural state of affairs, the great leveling of the Industrial Revolution, where an individual's productive capacity is tied to their population and arable land, as all countries across the world adopt the same technologies. And then in a wide range of fields, China is pushing ahead. They are investing heavily in space technology, in AI, in high R&D. Many of their universities, Tsinghua University, for example, are in the top 10 in the world, whereas before they weren't in the top 100. So China is not seeing itself as this third world country filled with poverty, where it's trying to lift everyone up through mass production anymore. They're seeing themselves as a top-tier power leading the world in all these fields of endeavor, and they're willing to challenge the United States even in the areas of American strength. So China is not willing, will never be willing, to just accept a subordinate role to the United States in the international system. In fact, it won't even accept being an equal. It will always perceive itself to be the pinnacle of human civilization, and the human story should be the Han story in their view. So keep that in mind. It is a massive struggle in the 21st century between Western liberal tradition, sovereignty of the individual, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, and Han Confucianism. They are not compatible ideologies, and they will not survive together. So all this notion that we're all going to work together peaceably and work things out, that simply has no historical comparator. The Thucydides trap is real. And established power does brush up against a rising power, and there is no point of commonality between these two countries that would allow them to get along side by side. The United States does believe in its own manifest destiny, its own exceptionalism, its own universal law. Its values are universal in their mind, which is one of the positive things about the United States. But China also has its exceptionalism. It doesn't have a universal perspective. Not everyone can be Han Chinese. But Han Chinese do sit at the top of that very large pyramid. So keep this in mind. This is the struggle of the 21st century, and there is no middle ground. One will win and the other will lose. It is zero sum. That is the way great power relations work. That is the tragedy of great power relations. So yes, that's hopefully really lays out why, if you're in the Politburo in China, or if you're a young Chinese aspiring to the future of your nationhood, why they will not accept a compromise on this. They will take Taiwan. They will take the first island chain. They might even want to kick the United States out of Hawaii. They'll probably stick up for the native Hawaiians. All of these things are absolutely possible this century, and nothing should be discounted. That's my view. Please leave your comments down below. If you disagree with me, absolutely do so. This is one of the things you'd like to be wrong on. And happy for anyone to share this video for further discussion. Please subscribe if you haven't already. And I'll see you next time. Thank you.